The click of Vivian Harrington's Louboutin heels on the courthouse marble sounded like gunshots in the silence, each step a declaration that she had already won a trial that hadn't even started. If you're ready to see privilege crumble under the weight of justice, hit that like button now. The courtroom of Judge Elias Monroe had seen wealth before, had witnessed power parade itself through those heavy oak doors. But what walked in that Tuesday morning was something different. It was entitlement so complete, so unquestioned, that it had calcified into Vivian Harrington's very bones. At 26, she moved through the world as if it were a stage built specifically for her performance, and every other human being was simply part of the backdrop. Her honey blonde hair was styled in waves that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her cream-colored designer suit probably exceeded the annual income of the family she'd destroyed. Judge Monroe sat motionless behind his bench, a mountain of composed authority, his silver hair catching the morning light that filtered through the tall windows. At 63, Elias Monroe had presided over this courtroom for 27 years, and in that time, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read human character in the first 30 seconds of observation. His dark eyes, set deep beneath heavy brows, tracked Vivian's entrance with the focus of a raptor watching prey, though his expression remained as unreadable as ancient stone. The bailiff's voice cut through the heavy air. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Elias Monroe presiding. Court is now in session in the matter of the People versus Vivian Christine Harrington." The gallery was packed, every wooden bench filled with spectators who had heard the whispers, read the headlines, seen the viral video that had ignited a firestorm of public outrage. In the front row sat Marcus and Jennifer Chen, both in their early 50s, wearing clothes that had been carefully chosen to show respect for the court, despite being years out of fashion. Jennifer's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her purse, her eyes red-rimmed from weeks of crying. Beside her, Marcus sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in his face twitched periodically. Their son David's empty seat between them was a wound that would never heal. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Rachel Simmons, was a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that had seen enough injustice to fuel a lifetime of righteous anger. She rose from her table, her movements economical and purposeful, carrying a thick file that represented 6 months of meticulous investigation. "Your Honor," Simmons began, her voice clear and steady, "the people will prove that on the night of March 15th, the defendant, Vivian Harrington, operating a vehicle while intoxicated with a blood alcohol level of 0.17, more than twice the legal limit, struck and killed 23-year-old David Chen, a graduate student at Morrison University, who was walking home from the library at approximately 11:15 p.m. We will further prove that Miss Harrington fled the scene, attempted to conceal evidence, and used her family's considerable political influence to obstruct justice. Vivian's attorney, Gerald Whitmore, was exactly what money could buy. A man in his 60s with perfect silver hair, a $10,000 suit, and a reputation for getting wealthy clients acquitted through a combination of legal brilliance and scorched earth tactics. He stood with theatrical gravity, buttoning his jacket with deliberate slowness. "Your Honor, my client is innocent of these spurious charges. This is a tragic accident being weaponized for political purposes against Governor Harrington's family. We will demonstrate that Miss Harrington was not impaired, that the victim stepped into traffic without warning, and that my client stopped as soon as it was safe to do so. This is nothing more than a witch hunt against a prominent family." Judge Monroe's eyes shifted to Whitmore, and for just a moment, the temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. "Counselor Whitmore," he said, his voice low and resonant, each word carved from granite. "In my courtroom, a dead 23-year-old is not a tragic accident to be minimized. He is a human being whose life had value. You will address him with respect, or you will find yourself held in contempt. Are we clear?" Whitmore's confident smile faltered for just an instant before he recovered. "Of course, Your Honor. My apologies. Please proceed with your opening statement, Miss Simmons." The prosecutor moved to stand before the jury, her posture straight, her gaze sweeping across the 12 faces that would decide Vivian Harrington's fate. "David Chen was the first person in his family to attend college," she began, and Jennifer Chen's quiet sob punctuated the statement. "His parents, who emigrated from Taiwan 30 years ago, worked multiple jobs to give their son opportunities they never had. Marcus Chen worked nights at a warehouse. Jennifer Chen cleaned houses during the day and worked as a seamstress in the evenings. David was their miracle, their pride, their hope for a better future. Simmons pulled out a photograph and displayed it on the courtroom's large monitor. A young man with kind eyes and a brilliant smile, wearing his graduation cap and gown, flanked by his beaming parents. David Chen was 3 months from completing his master's degree in environmental engineering. He had just been offered a position at a firm that develops clean water solutions for developing countries. He was going to change the world. He was going to make his parents' sacrifices mean something. The prosecutor's voice hardened. On March 15th, David Chen spent the evening at Morrison University's library, working on his thesis. At 11:03 p.m., he texted his mother to say he was walking home and would see her in 20 minutes. Campus security footage shows him leaving the library at 11:07. He never made it home. The monitor switched to a grainy security camera image showing David walking down a sidewalk, backpack over his shoulder, completely unaware that he had less than 8 minutes to live. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. At 11:15 p.m., Vivian Harrington's Mercedes G-Wagon, traveling at approximately 60 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone, struck David Chen at the intersection of University Boulevard and Maple Street. The impact threw him 37 feet. He died instantly of catastrophic injuries. Simmons paused, letting the horror of those words settle over the courtroom. Miss Harrington did not stop. She did not call 911. She did not render aid. She fled the scene and drove directly to her father's estate, where she called the family attorney before she called the police. Vivian sat beside her attorney, her expression one of bored irritation, as if she were sitting through a tedious business presentation rather than a trial about a life she had taken. She examined her manicured nails, sighed quietly, and whispered something to Whitmore that made him lean in with concern. When police finally located Miss Harrington 4 hours later, Simmons continued, she claimed she thought she had hit a deer, in the middle of an urban intersection. She stated that she was confused and frightened, which is why she drove home. Testing revealed her blood alcohol level was still 0.134 hours after the incident, meaning at the time of impact, she was severely intoxicated. The prosecutor moved closer to the jury. The defense will try to convince you that this was an accident, a terrible mistake. But here's what they won't tell you. This was not Miss Harrington's first DUI. It was her third. The first 2 were quietly dismissed after intervention by her father's office. They won't tell you that Miss Harrington was recorded by multiple witnesses at a club called Elevation, where she consumed at least 6 cocktails before getting behind the wheel. They won't tell you that after killing David Chen, she called her attorney, not to turn herself in, but to ask how to make this go away. All of this will be proven through phone records, witness testimony, and forensic evidence. Simmons returned to her table and looked directly at Judge Monroe. Your Honor, members of the jury, this case is about accountability. It's about whether justice in this country applies equally to everyone, or whether wealth and political connections place certain people above the law. David Chen's parents are here today, seeking the only thing they have left, the truth, and justice for their son. As Simmons sat down, the weight of her words hung in the air like smoke. Judge Monroe's gaze moved to the defense table, where Whitmore was already rising, his expression now set in determination. Your Honor, if I may present our opening statement? Monroe nodded once, a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. Whitmore approached the jury with the easy confidence of a man who had won cases that should have been unwinnable. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard a very emotional story. And make no mistake, what happened to David Chen is a tragedy. But a tragedy is not necessarily a crime. My client, Vivian Harrington, is also a victim here. A victim of public hysteria, media sensationalism, and political opportunism. Several members of the gallery shifted uncomfortably, and Judge Monroe's eyes narrowed fractionally, though he said nothing. The prosecution wants you to believe that my client is some kind of monster who carelessly took a life and then callously fled. But the evidence will show something very different. Miss Harrington was driving within a reasonable speed for the road conditions, had consumed alcohol but was not impaired, and stopped as soon as she realized what had happened. The forensic evidence regarding the impact pattern will demonstrate that Mr. Chen stepped into the roadway at an angle that gave my client no time to react. Jennifer Chen let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, and Marcus had to physically restrain her from standing up. Judge Monroe raised one hand, a simple gesture that somehow commanded instant silence. "Mrs. Chen," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority despite its low volume. "I understand your pain, but you must remain composed, or I will have to ask you to step outside. I promise you this, the truth will be heard in this courtroom." Jennifer nodded, tears streaming down her face, and Marcus pulled her against him, both of them shaking with grief and rage. Whitmore continued, seemingly unfazed. "The previous incidents the prosecution mentioned were dismissed because they were baseless. Miss Harrington has never been convicted of any crime. She is a graduate of Pembroke University, a philanthropist who has donated substantial time and resources to charitable causes, and a young woman whose life has been destroyed by this tragic accident and the media circus that followed." As Whitmore spoke, Vivian's phone vibrated on the table. She picked it up, glanced at the screen, and actually smiled. A small, private smile that suggested the message was amusing. The gesture was so casual, so utterly disconnected from the gravity of the moment, that several jurors visibly reacted. Judge Monroe's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Miss Harrington." Vivian looked up, startled, her smile fading. "In my courtroom, you will show respect for these proceedings. Put that device away, and do not touch it again until we are adjourned. Am I making myself clear?" For the first time since entering the courtroom, Vivian seemed to recognize that she might not be in complete control. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, though her tone carried an undercurrent of resentment. "Counselor Whitmore, continue." The trial proceeded with the mechanical precision of legal procedure, but beneath the formality, tension built like pressure in a sealed container. The prosecution called its first witness, Officer Daniel Martinez, the first responding officer to the scene. Martinez, a veteran cop in his 40s with the exhausted eyes of someone who had seen too much death, took the stand and was sworn in. Under Simmons's questioning, he described arriving at the intersection to find David Chen's body in the street, his backpack scattered across the asphalt, his thesis papers blowing in the wind. "Can you describe the scene, Officer Martinez?" Simmons asked. Martinez's voice was steady, but heavy with the weight of memory. "I've been on the force for 22 years. I've seen a lot of traffic fatalities. But this one..." He paused, collecting himself. The victim's body was approximately 37 feet from the initial impact point, the force required to throw a human being that distance. His injuries were catastrophic. There were skid marks on the road, but they didn't start until well after the impact point, indicating the driver initially accelerated or maintained speed before attempting to brake. "What else did you observe?" "We found fragments of a headlight and pieces of chrome trim at the scene. We also found the victim's cell phone, which was still clutched in his hand. His last text message, sent to his mother, was still on the screen. It said, 'Almost home. Love you.'" The courtroom was silent except for Jennifer Chen's muffled weeping. Whitmore's cross-examination was aggressive. "Officer Martinez, isn't it true that pedestrians are required to cross at marked crosswalks?" "Yes, but..." "And David Chen was not at a marked crosswalk when he was struck, correct?" "The crosswalk was less than 20 feet away, but..." "Please just answer yes or no, officer." "He was not in a marked crosswalk?" "No, he was not. But the pedestrian has right-of-way at that intersection regardless." "Thank you, officer. No further questions." Judge Monroe's expression darkened. "Counselor Whitmore," the witness was attempting to provide context. "Officer Martinez, please complete your answer." Martinez nodded gratefully. "That intersection has stop signs in all 4 directions. Any pedestrian has the right to cross. The driver had a legal obligation to stop and yield, regardless of whether Mr. Chen was in a painted crosswalk or not." Over the next 2 days, the prosecution built its case with methodical precision. They called witnesses from Elevation nightclub who testified that Vivian had been extremely intoxicated and could barely walk when she left. They called the toxicologist who explained that Vivian's blood alcohol level, 4 hours after the incident, indicated severe impairment at the time of impact. They called the forensic accident reconstructionist, who testified that Vivian had been traveling at least 58 miles per hour based on the impact pattern, and that she would have had ample time to stop if she had been paying attention. But the most devastating moment came when Simmons called Detective Sarah Ewan, the lead investigator on the case. Detective Ewan was a woman in her late 30s, compact and intense, with the focused energy of someone who took her job personally. Under Simmons' questioning, she described the investigation, the evidence collected, and finally, the moment that had made national headlines. Detective Ewan, please tell the court about your interview with Miss Harrington at the governor's estate. Ewan consulted her notes. I arrived at the Harrington estate at approximately 4:30 a.m. on March 16th. Miss Harrington was in the main house with her attorney and her father, Governor Richard Harrington. When I informed her that she was under arrest for vehicular manslaughter and leaving the scene of a fatal accident, she became agitated. What did she say? Ewan looked directly at the jury. She said, and I'm quoting from my notes here, "This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong. Do you know who my father is? This is going to disappear by morning, and you're going to be directing traffic in some nowhere town for the rest of your career." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and Judge Monroe's gavel came down once, a sound like a gunshot that instantly restored silence. "Anything else?" Simmons asked. "Yes. When I moved to handcuff her, she pulled away and said, 'You can't arrest me. My family owns this state. Nothing's going to happen to me.' That kid should have watched where he was going." Ewan's voice remained level, but her contempt was palpable. Those were her exact words. That kid should have watched where he was going. The silence that followed was suffocating. Several jurors stared at Vivian with unconcealed disgust. Jennifer Chen buried her face in her husband's shoulder, her whole body shaking. Marcus Chen's face was a mask of rage and grief, and Vivian Harrington sat at the defense table, her expression showing more annoyance than remorse, as if she were being unfairly persecuted for something trivial. Whitmore's cross-examination was brief and ineffective, and everyone in the courtroom knew why. There was no way to spin those words into something innocent. When the prosecution rested its case, the weight of evidence was crushing. Whitmore's defense was predictably flimsy. Character witnesses who testified to Vivian's charitable work, experts who tried to suggest David Chen had darted into traffic too quickly for anyone to avoid, and Vivian's own testimony, which would prove to be her final and fatal mistake. When Vivian took the stand, she was dressed in a modest blue dress that her legal team had clearly selected to make her appear sympathetic, but the expensive jewelry she refused to remove undermined the effect. She sat in the witness box with perfect posture, her expression arranged in what was meant to be sadness, but looked more like irritation. Whitmore led her through a carefully scripted version of events. She was driving carefully. She had only had 2 drinks over several hours. David Chen appeared suddenly in front of her car. She panicked and drove home in shock. But then Simmons rose for cross-examination, and the temperature in the room changed. "Miss Harrington, you testified that you only had 2 drinks at Elevation nightclub on the night of March 15th. Is that correct?" "Yes. But 7 witnesses, including 2 bartenders, testified that you consumed at least 6 cocktails. Are they all lying?" "They're mistaken. It was crowded. They probably saw me with drinks that belonged to friends." "I see. And your blood alcohol level of 0.13 4 hours after the incident, when your body would have metabolized a significant amount of alcohol, how do you explain that if you only had 2 drinks?" I'm small. Alcohol affects me more. You're 5'7" and weigh approximately 130 pounds according to your driver's license. At that size, 2 drinks over several hours would not produce a 0.13 blood alcohol level 4 hours later. Would it? Vivian's composure began to crack. "I don't know. I'm not a scientist." "Miss Harrington, you testified that you panicked and drove home, but phone records show that you made 3 calls before leaving the scene. 1 to your attorney, 1 to your father, and 1 to a friend. If you were in shock, how did you have the presence of mind to call your attorney before calling 911? I wanted advice on what to do." "Advice on what to do? Miss Harrington, a human being was lying dead in the street. What advice did you need beyond calling an ambulance?" "I was confused." Simmons moved closer, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Confused enough to drive 30 miles home? Confused enough to call your attorney, but not confused enough to help a dying man? I didn't know he was dead. I thought I hit a deer." "A deer, in the middle of an urban intersection." "Miss Harrington, did you see the impact?" "Yes, but..." "And did what you hit look like a deer?" "It was dark. Did it look like a deer, yes or no?" Vivian's face flushed. "No, but I thought..." "You thought it was a deer. even though it looked like a person? I panicked. Miss Harrington, Detective Ewan testified that when she arrested you, you said, and I quote, "That kid should have watched where he was going." Do you remember saying that? Vivian's eyes darted to her attorney. No, I don't. You don't remember, or you didn't say it. I didn't say that. She's lying. Detective Ewan is lying? She's trying to make me look bad. Miss Harrington, is it also a lie that you told her your family owns this state and that nothing would happen to you? The courtroom held its collective breath. That's taken out of context, Vivian said, her voice rising. I was upset. My father is the governor, and people were treating me like a criminal. You are a criminal, Miss Harrington. You killed a man and fled the scene. Objection! Whitmore was on his feet. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Monroe said quietly, but his eyes were fixed on Vivian with an intensity that could have burned through steel. Miss Simmons, rephrase. Miss Harrington, do you feel any remorse for David Chen's death? The question hung in the air, and everyone in the courtroom leaned forward slightly, waiting for the answer that would define everything. Vivian opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. And in that moment of hesitation, her true nature emerged like a serpent from beneath a rock. Look, she said, her voice taking on an edge of defensiveness tinged with arrogance. What happened was an accident. I feel bad that someone died, but I'm not going to apologize for something that wasn't my fault. That kid stepped into the road without looking. If anyone's to blame, it's him. And honestly, I'm the real victim here. My life has been destroyed by this media circus. My reputation, my future, everything. All because of one mistake that could have happened to anyone. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. Jennifer Chen stood up, her face contorted with grief and rage. His name was David, she screamed, her voice breaking. His name was David Chen, and he was my son. He was a person, not that kid. Marcus was trying to hold her. Judge Monroe's gavel was coming down. Bailiffs were moving, but none of it could contain the emotional devastation that Vivian's words had unleashed. Order! Monroe's voice cut through the chaos like a thunderclap. Order in this court. Mrs. Chen, please, I understand your pain, but you must sit down. Jennifer collapsed back into her seat, sobbing uncontrollably, and the entire courtroom seemed to deflate with her. Judge Monroe's eyes moved to Vivian, and in them was something that made even her attorney shift uncomfortably. Miss Harrington, he said, his voice so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear it. You will step down from the witness stand. The trial concluded with closing arguments that were almost anticlimactic. Simmons methodically reviewed the overwhelming evidence, while Whitmore made a desperate plea for reasonable doubt that convinced no one. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Monroe asked. The jury foreman, a middle-aged black man who had spent much of the trial with a look of barely contained anger, stood. We have, Your Honor. What say you? On the count of vehicular manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of driving under the influence causing death, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of leaving the scene of a fatal accident, we find the defendant guilty. Vivian's face went white. For the first time since the trial began, genuine fear crossed her features. She turned to her attorney, who put a hand on her shoulder but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Judge Monroe set the sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, and on that gray morning in early May, the courtroom was even more packed than it had been during the trial. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the back wall and spilling out into the corridor. Vivian stood before the bench, her attorney beside her, and for the first time, she looked small, diminished, the armor of entitlement finally beginning to crack. Judge Monroe looked down at her from the bench, his expression carved from granite, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute moral authority. Miss Harrington, I have been a judge for 27 years. In that time, I have presided over hundreds of cases and sentenced countless defendants. I have seen poverty drive people to crime. I have seen addiction destroy lives. I have seen rage and passion lead to terrible acts. And while those circumstances do not excuse criminal behavior, they at least provide context for understanding it. He paused, and the silence was suffocating. But this case is different. You were not driven by desperation or addiction or momentary passion. You were driven by something far more corrosive, the belief that you are above the law. You killed a young man whose life had immeasurable value, and in the aftermath you showed not remorse, but indignation that you were being held accountable. You referred to David Chen as that kid, as if he were an inconvenience rather than a human being. You stated that he should have watched where he was going, placing the blame for his death on the victim. And most damningly, you proclaimed that your family's political connections would protect you from consequences. Judge Monroe leaned forward slightly, his eyes boring into Vivian with an intensity that made her flinch. Let me be absolutely clear about something, Miss Harrington. In this courtroom, your last name means nothing. Your father's position means nothing. Your wealth means nothing. The law applies equally to everyone, or it means nothing at all. And I will not allow this court to become a place where the privileged escape justice while the powerless suffer. He picked up a document, though he didn't need to read from it. These words came from somewhere deeper than paper. David Chen was 23 years old. He was the son of immigrants who sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. He was brilliant, compassionate, and driven by a desire to make the world better. He was studying environmental engineering so he could help provide clean water to people who need it. His parents worked multiple jobs to put him through school. He was 3 months from his master's degree. He had just been offered his dream job. He texted his mother to say he was almost home and that he loved her. Those were his last words. Jennifer Chen's quiet sobs were the only sound in the courtroom. "And you took all of that away," Monroe continued, his voice rising with controlled fury. "You took away his future, his dreams, his chance to contribute to this world. You took away his parents' joy, their pride, their reason for all those years of sacrifice. You created a wound in their lives that will never heal. And when confronted with what you had done, you felt not remorse, but resentment. You were angry at being inconvenienced. You expected your family's name to erase your crime." He set the document down. "I have read letters from David's professors, who described him as one of the most promising students they had ever taught. I have read letters from his friends, who described his kindness and his passion for justice. I have sat in this courtroom and watched his parents grieve. And I have watched you, Miss Harrington, display a level of callousness and entitlement that is genuinely shocking." Judge Monroe's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, which somehow made it even more powerful. "You said your family owns this state. You said nothing would happen to you. You were wrong. This courtroom is where entitlement comes to die. This is where accountability is enforced. This is where justice is served, regardless of who your father is or how much money you have." He picked up another document, this one the sentencing order. "On the count of vehicular manslaughter, I sentence you to 15 years in state prison. On the count of DUI causing death, I sentence you to 10 years, to run consecutively. On the count of leaving the scene of a fatal accident, I sentence you to 5 years, also consecutive. Your total sentence is 30 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 20 years. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Vivian's face went from white to gray. She gripped the table in front of her, her knees buckling slightly. "But I'm not finished," Monroe continued. "Upon your release, you will be on supervised probation for 10 years. Your driver's license is permanently revoked. You will be required to perform 5,000 hours of community service related to drunk driving prevention. And every year on the anniversary of David Chen's death, you will be required to visit his grave and report to this court that you have done so." Whitmore found his voice. "Your Honor, with respect, this sentence is extraordinarily harsh. We will appeal." Monroe's gaze shifted to the attorney, and Whitmore fell silent. "Counselor, your client killed a man while driving drunk, fled the scene, attempted to use her family's influence to escape justice, and showed no remorse. If anything, this sentence is merciful. Your appeal is your right, but I am confident it will be denied. This sentence stands." Monroe turned his attention back to Vivian. "Miss Harrington, I want you to understand something. You will spend the next 2 decades in prison, and every day, I want you to think about David Chen. I want you to think about his parents, who will spend the rest of their lives missing their son. I want you to think about the research he would have done, the lives he would have saved, the difference he would have made in this world. I want you to think about the fact that you took all of that away because you were too selfish and too arrogant to call a cab." He paused, and his next words carried the finality of a tomb being sealed. "You said your family owns this court. You were wrong. This court belongs to the people. It belongs to justice. It belongs to truth. And today, justice has been served. Bailiff, remand the defendant into custody. As the bailiffs moved to take Vivian into custody, she finally broke. Tears streamed down her face. Her perfect composure shattered completely. "Please," she whispered. "Please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Judge Monroe's expression didn't change. "Your remorse, Miss Harrington, comes too late and costs too little. Perhaps in 20 years, after you have had time to reflect on the gravity of what you have done, it will be genuine. Until then, you will face the consequences of your actions." As Vivian was led from the courtroom, her hands cuffed behind her back, her designer clothes already seeming out of place in the harsh reality she now faced, Jennifer and Marcus Chen held each other and wept. Not tears of joy, because there could be no joy in a world without their son, but tears of relief that at least justice had been done, that David's life had been valued, that his death had meaning. Judge Monroe sat behind his bench, watching the courtroom slowly empty, his face a mask of judicial composure. But in his eyes, those who looked closely could see a glimmer of something else. Satisfaction that, at least in this one case, the powerful had been held accountable, that privilege had not conquered justice, that one family's pain had been acknowledged and honored. Outside the courthouse, as reporters swarmed and cameras flashed, Marcus Chen made a brief statement, his wife beside him, both of them exhausted and hollowed out by grief, but standing straight with dignity. "My son was a good person," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "He had dreams. He had plans to help people. Vivian Harrington took that away from him, from us, from the world. No sentence can bring David back. No punishment can fill the hole in our lives. But today, justice was served. Today, David's life was valued. Today, the system worked the way it is supposed to work. And we are grateful to Judge Monroe for seeing our son not as that kid, but as a human being who mattered." The story spread rapidly across social media and news outlets, not just the verdict and sentence, but Judge Monroe's words, which were replayed thousands of times. People who had never heard of David Chen learned his name. His photograph was shared alongside quotes from his thesis about providing clean water access to underserved communities. Petitions were started to fund scholarships in his name. The intersection where he died became a memorial, covered in flowers and cards and photographs. And in a prison cell, Vivian Harrington lay on a narrow bunk and stared at a concrete ceiling, finally beginning to understand that her father's power stopped at the prison gates, that her family's money could not buy her freedom, and that she would spend the next 20 years paying for the night she decided that her convenience was worth more than David Chen's life. The message echoed across the nation. Privilege is not armor. Wealth is not immunity. And in a courtroom presided over by a judge who values justice above all else, the powerful and the powerless stand on equal ground. Because justice, real justice, is blind to everything except the truth. If this story moved you, if you believe that justice should apply equally to everyone regardless of their last name or bank account, show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to this channel. Comment "Justice for All" below, or tell us where you're watching from. David Chen's story matters. His life mattered. And stories like this remind us that when the system works the way it should, accountability can still triumph over entitlement. Let's keep that message alive.